Rock and roll in the early days was full of sweet pop songs, catchy, short, and made to sell. But behind the smiles and harmonies, there was a storm coming. According to Deep Purple's drummer Ian Paice, one band changed everything before the world even had a name for hard rock or heavy metal. They took rock and pushed it beyond the radio-friendly tunes, laying down riffs that were heavier, darker, and more powerful than anyone had heard. Paice said it clearly. They were doing heavy music before everybody. Let's uncover their story in 10 chapters. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, rock and roll was bright, youthful, and fun. Elvis Presley shook his hips, Buddy Holly wore his glasses, and Chuck Berry played fast guitar runs that inspired millions. But most of it was simple, songs about love, cars, and dancing. For many, rock and roll was just teenage entertainment. The world hadn't yet felt the weight of distorted guitars shaking the ground. But in the background, a few musicians weren't satisfied. They wanted more noise, more power, more attitude. The stage was being set for something that would explode into heavy rock. Ian Paice wasn't talking about Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath, even though fans often credit those groups with inventing heavy music. Instead, he was pointing to the Kinks. Before anyone else, the Kinks took sharp guitar riffs and turned them into something raw and aggressive. Their 1964 hit, You Really Got Me, sounded nothing like the polished pop of the time. It was rough, heavy, and built around a distorted guitar sound that shocked listeners. Without the Kinks, the path for hard rock and later heavy metal would have looked completely different. They were the real spark. The Kinks didn't just write songs, they built riffs. Ray Davies wrote the words, but his brother Dave Davies shaped the sound. Dave famously slashed his little amplifier's speaker cone with a razor blade to create that gritty, distorted fuzz that defined You Really Got Me. That raw tone was revolutionary. It wasn't about pretty melodies anymore. It was about power. The riff carried the song more than the lyrics did. For the first time, rock felt dangerous, almost threatening. This was the blueprint for everything bands like Deep Purple, Sabbath, and Zeppelin would later build. When You Really Got Me hit the airwaves, it sent shockwaves across the music world. Some fans loved it instantly, while others thought it was too rough and messy. The BBC even questioned whether such a noisy track could be broadcast. But teenagers felt it in their bones. It was rebellious in a way that Elvis never was. Instead of polished charm, it gave them raw power. The Kinks had unknowingly created one of the first true hard rock songs. For Ian Paice and future rockers, this wasn't just a hit, it was the future being born. The mid-1960s British music scene was exploding. The Beatles had conquered the world, the Rolling Stones were getting gritty, and the Who smashed their instruments. But the Kinks stood apart. Their riffs inspired musicians who were searching for something heavier. Young guitarists studied Dave Davies's tone, wondering how he made his amp growl like that. This influence trickled into garage bands and eventually into the heavier British sound of the late 1960s. By the time Deep Purple formed, the idea of a riff-driven, powerful song was already in the air, thanks to the Kinks. Even though the Kinks shaped heavy rock's foundations, they rarely get full credit. History often highlights Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple as the pioneers of heavy music, but as Ian Paice reminded the world, the Kinks were doing it before everybody. Their early singles may not have been labeled metal, but the energy and raw aggression were undeniable. They were proof that heavy music didn't appear overnight. It was born step by step. The Kinks laid the first brick in a wall that others would later build into a fortress of sound. While You Really Got Me is often seen as their defining riff, the Kinks followed up with more heavy-hitting tracks like All Day and All of the Night. Again, the power was in the guitars, not just the lyrics. These songs showed it wasn't a one-time experiment. It was their style. Each record carried that same rebellious weight. They weren't just playing pop with distortion. They were reshaping what rock could sound like. For Paice and other musicians coming up in the 60s, the Kinks were proof that music could be tougher, louder, and still reach the charts. Every great movement starts with seeds. The Kinks planted them. Later, Deep Purple would make songs like Smoke on the Water, Led Zeppelin would shake arenas with Whole Lotta Love, and Black Sabbath would invent heavy metal darkness with Paranoid. But all of these roots trace back to the first distorted riff that broke away from pretty pop songs. Ian Paice wasn't exaggerating. The Kinks gave permission for rock to get heavy. They showed the next wave of musicians that it was okay to be loud, rough, and unapologetically powerful. So why did Ian Paice make sure to mention the Kinks? Because history often forgets the quiet innovators. Deep Purple themselves know what it feels like to be overshadowed by Zeppelin and Sabbath in the heavy rock origin story. Paice wanted to set the record straight. He knew the Kinks had been there first, giving everyone else the tools to go heavier. It wasn't just respect, it was truth. For him, the story of heavy music wasn't complete without giving credit to Ray and Dave Davies, the brothers who unknowingly rewrote rock history. In the end, the Kinks weren't trying to invent a new genre, they were just pushing rock as far as they could. But in doing so, they became the first band to make rock truly heavy. They smashed through the clean walls of pop and built something raw, more pièces, powerful, and more lasting. Ian Paice's words remind us that before Sabbath's doom, before Zeppelin's thunder, before Deep Purple's fire, there was the Kinks, with a tiny amp, a razor blade, and a riff that shook the world. Rock and roll would never be the same again. The story of heavy rock cannot be told without Dave Davies' razor blade. His experiment to slash his small Elpico amplifier wasn't just rebellion, it was innovation. Before fuzz pedals became standard, Davies invented distortion with a simple act of frustration. The result was the gritty guitar sound that powered You Really Got Me. It was dirty, raw, and unlike anything the polished record companies expected. That single act showed musicians everywhere that sound could be manipulated, not just played clean. In many ways, Dave Davies created the first metal tone, years before the world had a word for it. The Kinks didn't exist in a vacuum. They were competing with the Beatles' sweet harmonies and the Rolling Stones' blues swagger. While the Beatles were topping charts with I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Kinks were roaring with All Day and All of the Night. It was heavier, meaner, and more primal. Some critics dismissed them as too harsh compared to the smoother pop of the time. But teenagers who felt restless and angry connected deeply with the Kinks. They weren't polite or charming. They were raw, messy, and real. That contrast made them essential to rock's evolution. The Kinks' heavy riffs didn't stop with the 60s. Their sound echoed through every generation of rock that followed. Punk bands borrowed their simplicity and aggression. Hard rockers built upon their riff-first approach. Even heavy metal giants like Metallica have acknowledged how early British rockers paved the way. Ian Paice's words highlight this chain reaction. Without the Kinks, there might never have been Deep Purple, Sabbath, or Zeppelin in the form we know. They lit the fuse, and decades later, every time a distorted guitar kicks in, it carries a piece of that original Kinks rebellion,